You are hungry, not the mild, manageable hunger of the person who has skipped lunch and is starting to think about dinner. The specific bone-deep background noise hunger of someone who has been eating at approximately 70% of their caloric needs for the past 3 weeks, whose body has made the metabolic adjustments that sustained insufficiency requires, and whose thoughts have acquired the specific, food-focused narrowing that the chronically hungry brain performs automatically. The way food moves to the center of awareness, the way the smell of cooking from a nearby house stops being background and becomes foreground, the way the calculation of what is left in the stores and how long it needs to last has become the ongoing mental arithmetic of the waking day. It is February. The harvest was 7 months ago. The grain stored in October is still adequate, but it is no longer abundant. The careful rationing of the past weeks has ensured that the store will last. To spring, probably, if the spring comes, when it usually does, and if nobody gets sick in a way that changes the household's capacity to work. The root vegetables in the cellar are at the stage where you are eating the ones that are beginning to turn before they become unusable entirely. The salt meat barrel still has something in it, but the something is the pieces that were at the bottom, the pieces that were packed last and processed least carefully, and the soaking they require to make them palatable adds to the work and the fuel cost of the meal. You're going to cook, not because you have a lot to cook with, but because you have something, and because the something, treated with the specific knowledge that turns limited ingredients into adequate food, can produce a meal that will keep the household going for another day. The meal you are going to cook is not the meal of the feast day, or the Sunday celebration, or the Lord's Hall. It is the meal of the ordinary day. The cheap meal, the everyday meal, the meal that the majority of medieval people ate for the majority of their meals, for the majority of their lives. It is the meal whose history the cookbooks don't record as carefully as the feast day preparations, because the people writing the cookbooks were writing for the households that could afford to think about food rather than simply consume it. But the cheap meal had its own specific intelligence, the accumulated, tested, generationally transmitted knowledge of how to make the available ingredients produce the maximum nourishment and the maximum palatability with the minimum cost and the minimum waste. The medieval poor were not bad cooks who happened to have nothing to cook. They were skilled cooks working with the specific constraint of very limited ingredients, and the specific skills of the limited ingredient cuisine were real skills whose results were, within their constraints, genuinely good. This script is about those meals, the pottage that formed the backbone of the medieval poor diet, the bread that was the caloric foundation of every social level, the legumes that were the protein source when meat was unavailable and too expensive, the foraged foods that supplemented the cultivated diet when the cultivated diet ran short, the specific preserving techniques that turned the autumn's abundance into the winter's sustenance. And, because this is also the food history that the modern cook finds most interesting, we are going to talk about how these meals actually tasted. Not the romantic version of medieval food, not the grim version, but the actual version. What the specific ingredients and the specific techniques produced in terms of flavor, and what the modern kitchen can do with those ingredients and techniques to produce something that is both historically informed and genuinely delicious. Let's start with the pottage. Chapter 1. The pottage, the meal that built the medieval world. The pottage was not a dish. This is the first thing to understand about the foundation of the medieval poor person's diet, because the word pottage, which appears on every historical menu reconstruction, in every academic account of the medieval diet, in every discussion of what medieval people ate, implies a specificity that the actual food didn't have. The pottage was not a dish with a recipe in the sense that the modern cook understands a recipe. Specific ingredients in specific proportions combined in a specific way to produce a specific result that the cook can reproduce consistently. The pottage was a method. It was the application of the pot and the water and the fire to to whatever the household had available in the proportions that the available quantities determined, producing a result that varied with every batch based on the specific combination of ingredients that the season, the stores, and the household's economic situation had assembled. The pottage was the medieval poor person's answer to the question of how to turn the available food into a meal. And the answer was, put it in the pot with water, add fire, wait. The pot itself was the primary cooking vessel of the medieval poor household. The single large ceramic or iron pot that hung over the fire from the pothook, or sat on the trivet in the embers, that was used for the pottage and for the boiling water, and for the rendering of the fat, and for the various other cooking operations that the household required. The ownership of a good pot was a genuine economic asset. The inventories of the medieval poor household, in the occasional documents that record such things, list the pot as one of the household's most valuable possessions, worth enough to be mentioned alongside the bed and the tools and the animals. The grain was the pottage's foundation. The specific grain varied by region and by what the household had grown or purchased. In England, the maslin of mixed wheat and rye, or the pure rye, or the oats that the northern regions favored. The grain was added to the water in whatever form the household found most convenient. The whole grain, which produced a porridge-like result after long cooking. The cracked or roughly ground grain, which cooked faster and produced a thicker result. Or in the form of the coarse flour that the grinding stone or the mill produced, which thickened the liquid most rapidly but required the most preparation. The legumes were the pottage's protein component, and their presence was the specific nutritional contribution that made the pottage a sustaining meal rather than simply a filling one. The dried peas, the field pea, the gray pea, the various pea varieties that the medieval field crop produced, were added to the pottage in the quantities that the household had available, soaked overnight to reduce the cooking time and to begin the process of breaking down the oligosaccharides that made dried legumes. The specific digestive challenge they have been throughout human culinary history. The soaking of the dried peas before cooking was not mere convenience. It was the specific culinary technique that addressed a real biological problem. The dried pea in its unsoaked state required hours of cooking to become edible, consuming both time and the fuel that the cooking fire required. The soaked pea cooked more quickly, absorbed the cooking liquid more thoroughly, and produced a better textured result in the finished pottage. The medieval cook who soaked the peas overnight was not following a recipe. They were applying the accumulated knowledge of generations of experience with this specific ingredient. The vegetables in the pottage were whatever the garden and the season provided. In summer and early autumn, this was genuine variety. The onions and the leeks, and the turnips, and the parsnips, and the various pot herbs from the kitchen garden that gave the summer pottage its specific, complex flavor. In winter and early spring, this narrowed to the stored root vegetables and the cold, hardy garden plants, the kale and the leek that survived the frost, the parsnip that improved with cold, the turnip that was the last resort of the hungry gap. The onion was the pottage's most important flavoring ingredient, and the role of the allium family in the medieval poor person's food was the role of the cheap, abundant, powerful flavoring that transformed the starchy grain and the earthy legumes into something that tasted of dinner rather than of raw ingredients boiled in water. The onion gave the pottage its foundation flavor. The caramelized sweetness of the onion cooked long and slow in the liquid, becoming the baseline taste that every other ingredient built on. The fat was the pottage's luxury component, the piece of salt pork, the ham hock, the rendered lard, the dripping saved from the occasional roasting. That transformed the meatless pottage into something with the specific richness and satisfaction that the fat's palatability provided. The fat in the pottage was not a flavoring in the modern chef's sense. It was not being added in measured quantities to achieve a specific texture or flavor profile. It was being added in whatever quantity was available, because fat was calories, fat was flavor, and fat was the specific component of the diet that the poor household's food supply was most consistently short of. The salt pork, the preserved pork that the Martinmas slaughter had produced, and that the barrel of brine was keeping through the winter, was added to the pottage in the quantities that the state of the barrel permitted. In November, the pork was abundant and the pottage was rich. In March, the pork was the last pieces at the bottom of the barrel, and the pottage's richness was theoretical. The pork's role was to give the pottage the specific meaty flavor that the long simmering of the bone or the piece of fatty pork in the pot produced, the specific, deep, savory quality that the modern cook recognizes as the flavor of the long-cooked meat stock, and that the medieval poor person experienced as the specific taste of a meal that had something in it beyond grain and water. The herbs were the pottage's specific cheap flavoring that the kitchen garden provided in abundance during the growing season and in dried form through the winter. The savory and the thyme and the parsley and the lovage, the pot herbs that the medieval garden produced as staples rather than luxuries, were added to the pottage in the specific way of the cook who uses what's available rather than what the recipe prescribes. The handful of fresh herbs thrown into the pot before serving, or the dried herb crumbled in from the winter store, was the final flavoring step that gave the finished pottage its specific aromatic quality. The cooking of the pottage was not quick. The medieval pottage was a long-cooked preparation. The pot hung over the fire for hours, the grain and the legumes requiring the sustained heat to break down the starches and the proteins into the digestible, palatable form that the long cooking produced. The medieval household that put the pottage on in the morning and ate it at midday was the household doing the pottage correctly, giving it the time that the ingredients required and using the fire's heat efficiently by letting the cooking happen over the long period rather than the intense heat of the quick boil. The pottage pot was the medieval household's slow cooker, the specific cooking vessel whose contents developed through the long, gentle cooking of the suspended pot over the fire in ways that the quick boil could not achieve. The grain that cooked for 3 hours was different from the grain that cooked for 20 minutes, not just in texture but in flavor. The long cooking developed the specific sweetness of the grain that the short cooking didn't reach, the Maillard reaction, and the caramelization that the long heat produced, creating the flavor depth that transformed grain and water into something that tasted like food. The pottage was eaten twice a day in the typical medieval poor household. The morning pottage, eaten before the working day began, and the evening pottage, eaten after the working day ended. The morning pottage was often the previous evening's pottage reheated, the specific convenience of the one-pot meal that improved with reheating, the flavors melding through the overnight period and developing in the morning's reheat into something more complex than the freshly made version. The specific taste of the pottage reheated from the previous evening was the specific taste of the medieval morning. The savory, thick, slightly smoky flavor of the grain and legume stew that had sat overnight and absorbed the cooking liquid's remaining flavors and developed the specific long-cooked depth that the fresh version lacked. This is not a bad taste. This is a genuinely good taste in the specific way that the overnight rest that good soups and stews develop their flavor. The French onion soup, the Italian minestrone, the Indian dal, is a real culinary phenomenon that the medieval cook was exploiting without knowing the chemistry that explains it. The pottage fed the medieval world, not the feast day pottage of the great household, with its spices and its refinements, the everyday pottage of the ordinary household, with its grain and its peas, and its onion, and its occasional piece of salt pork. The pottage was the meal that the laborer ate before going to the field, that the craftsman ate between the morning's work and the afternoons, that the children ate when they came in from wherever they had been, and that the oldest member of the household ate from the bowl that required the least chewing. It was the meal of the living, the basic, sustaining, adequate food that kept the medieval working population alive and working through the specific combination of caloric density and protein content that the grain and legume base provided. The pottage was not exciting food. It was real food, doing what food is supposed to do in the most fundamental sense, and the people who ate it day after day for decades were people who understood its value, in the way that you only understand the value of something when the alternative is hunger. Chapter 2. The bread, the caloric foundation of every social level. The bread was not optional. In the medieval dietary system, bread was not a side dish, not an accompaniment, not the thing you ate while waiting for the main course. Bread was the main course. It was the caloric foundation of the diet at every social level, from the coarse, dark maslin bread of the peasant to the white manchi of the Lord's table. And its presence at every meal was so universal and so fundamental that the absence of bread was not the absence of a food, but the absence of eating in any meaningful sense. The specific bread of the medieval poor person was not the white bread of the wealthy. The white bread, the bread made from the fine bolted sieved wheat flour from which the bran had been removed, was the bread of the people who could afford wheat and who could afford the additional processing that the sieving required. The bread of the poor was made from whatever grain the household had grown or purchased, in the mixture that the available quantities permitted, with whatever additional ingredients the limited stores required. The maslin, the mixture of wheat and rye that the medieval field commonly grew together, either deliberately as a mixed crop or as the result of the rye's persistence in the wheat field, was the standard bread grain of the English poor person. The maslin bread was darker than the white wheat bread, denser, more sour in flavor from the rye's specific contribution to the fermentation, and more nutritious in ways that the medieval poor person didn't know, but that the modern nutritionist confirms. The rye's fiber content, the specific vitamin and mineral profile of the whole grain flour, the lower glycemic index of the mixed grain bread compared to the white wheat bread, the rye bread of the regions where the climate favored rye over wheat, the northern and eastern European zones where the cool, wet summers that defeated wheat produced adequate rye crops, was the specific bread of those regions' poor populations, and its characteristic density and sourness was the flavor that generations of Northern European poor people grew up eating, and that the modern sourdough revival has rediscovered as the genuinely interesting bread that the industrial white loaf had displaced. The oat bannock of Scotland and Northern England, the flat, griddle-baked oat bread that the oat-growing regions of the north produced, was another bread of the poor that the specific grain of the specific region determined. Oats could not be easily leavened in the way that wheat bread was leavened. Oat flour lacks the gluten proteins that the yeast's carbon dioxide could expand into the specific network of gas bubbles that made the wheat loaf rise. But the flat, unleavened oat bannock baked on the hot stone of the griddle was a genuine bread product, caloric and sustaining, that the regions without adequate wheat could produce from what they had. The bread making was a skilled operation that the medieval household performed with the specific knowledge of the experienced baker rather than the recipe following of the modern cook. The leavening, the yeast culture that the experienced baker maintained from batch to batch, the specific living organism that the batter of the sourdough starter kept alive through the regular feeding of the flour and water that the fermentation required, was the household's most fragile culinary asset, the loss of which meant the flat, dense bread of the unleavened loaf, until a new culture could be established from the wild yeast of the environment. The medieval sourdough starter was not the artisanal affectation of the modern bread enthusiast's kitchen. It was the household's fermentation culture, maintained with the specific care of something genuinely valuable, passed between households when the neighboring household's starter died, and they needed a new one, carried when the household moved, kept alive through the cold of winter and the heat of summer with the attentive management of the experienced bread maker. The specific flavor of the medieval sourdough bread was the flavor of the long fermentation, the lactic acid, and the acetic acid that the bacterial component of the sourdough culture produced alongside the yeast's carbon dioxide, giving the bread the specific sourness that the modern sourdough bread still has, and that the medieval baker knew as simply the way bread tasted. The sourness was not a defect. It was the expected flavor of the bread. the specific flavor that the household's particular starter culture and the particular fermentation conditions of the particular kitchen produced in the consistent, household-specific way that the sourdough culture develops its characteristic flavor over time. The baking of the medieval bread was the operation that required either the household's own oven or the communal oven that the Lord's Manor provided at the cost of the oven fee. The clay oven, the domed clay structure heated by a wood fire inside and then swept clean for the bread to be placed in the retained heat, was the baking technology of the medieval period, and the management of the oven's heat was the specific skill that determined whether the bread came out properly baked or raw in the middle, or burned on the bottom, or any of the other failures that the imperfect heat management of the clay oven permitted. The oven fee, the payment, made to the Lord for the use of the communal oven, was one of the specific small costs of the manorial system that the medieval household paid regularly, and that the historian of the medieval economy documents as one of the numerous small extractions that the system required. The household that baked at home in their own clay oven avoided the fee, but required the investment of building and maintaining the oven and the fuel to heat it. The household that used the communal oven paid the fee, but avoided the capital investment of the private oven. The bread once baked lasted several days. The dense, whole-grain bread of the medieval poor kept longer than the light white bread of the wealthy, because the higher fiber content and the higher moisture content of the whole grain loaf slowed the staling process that the refined white flour accelerated. The 4-day-old Maslin bread of the peasant was still edible in ways that the 4-day-old manchet of the wealthy was not. The old bread had its specific uses in the medieval kitchen. The trencher bread, the day-old or older bread, that served as an edible plate for the more elaborate meals of the better-off household, soaking up the juices of the food placed on it, and eventually being eaten itself or given to the poor. The bread trencher was the medieval biodegradable plate, and its use reflected the specific waste management of the kitchen that treated every food product as something with a continued use, even in its degraded state. The bread soup was the specific use of the old bread that the poor household found most useful. The stale bread added to the pot of liquid, absorbing the stock or the water or whatever liquid was available, softening to the texture of the bread-thickened soup that was simultaneously a use for the old bread and the creation of a new meal. The bread soup, the panade, the soup à la mode, was the poor household's specific technique for turning the end-of-life bread into a meal rather than waste, and its descendants are present in the modern kitchen in the form of the Tuscan panzanella and the French soupe à l'oignon and the Italian ribollita, all of which are fundamentally the bread soup of the poor tradition, dressed in the regional culinary idiom of their specific place of origin. Chapter 3. The legumes, the medieval protein source that the modern world has forgotten. The pea was not a side dish, the specific cognitive error of the modern person. Thinking about medieval legumes is the error of the person who has grown up in a food culture where the pea is the frozen green sphere added to the plate for color and the occasional obligatory vegetable serving, and who imagines the medieval pea in this role. The side dish, the accompaniment, the garnish of the medieval meal. This is not what the pea was. The pea was the meal. The pea was the specific food that the majority of the medieval European population depended on for the protein that their diets required, and that the meat they could not afford to eat regularly would otherwise have provided. The field pea, Pisum sativum in its dry, starchy, field-grown form, was the medieval protein source in the way that the chicken breast is the modern protein source, present at most meals, relied upon as the reliable, accessible, affordable form of the nutritional component that the dietary system required. The specific difference between the medieval field pea and the modern chicken breast is the price. The field pea was the cheapest available protein source, grown on the same land as the grain crops and harvested alongside them, requiring no specific infrastructure and no cash outlay beyond the seed. The dried pea kept well. This was not a minor consideration in the medieval food system, where the preservation of food through the winter months was the specific challenge that organized the entire autumn's agricultural activity. The dried field pea, stored in sacks, in the dry conditions of the barn or the storage room, would last through the winter and into the spring without significant deterioration. The specific advantage of the dried legume over every other protein source available to the medieval poor, whose meat required the salt and the brine of the preservation barrel, and whose fresh eggs required the living chicken, and whose dairy required the living cow. The cooking of the dried pea required the soaking that we have discussed in the pottage context, and the specific result of the long-cooked, soaked dried pea was the specific texture that we now know primarily from the split pea soup and the mushy peas of the British chip shop tradition. The soft, slightly grainy, deeply savory puree that the long cooking of the dried pea produced. This was not the bright green, sweet, firm texture of the fresh garden pea or the frozen pea. It was a completely different food in texture, flavor, and nutritional profile, and the medieval poor person who ate pea pottage for dinner was eating something substantially different from the modern person who eats garden peas as a side. The pea pottage in its most basic form, the dried peas, water, onion, salt, and whatever fat the household had available, was the specific meal that the phrase peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old was describing. The nursery rhyme was not a children's fantasy. It was the documentation of the actual practice of the medieval and early modern poor household, in which the pea pottage was made in quantity, eaten hot, reheated, and eaten cold, and kept in the pot for as many days as the household needed it. The repeated reheating that preserved it from spoiling, also developing the specific flavor depth of the 9-day-old pottage that the rhyme records. The pea pottage 9 days old is not the grim picture that the modern food safety education presents. The daily reheating, bringing the pottage to the boil each day before serving it, was the specific food preservation technique that kept the bacterial load at the manageable level for the duration of the pot's use. The medieval household that did this was doing something that the modern food scientist would find dangerously close to the food safety limit, but that the practice of centuries had established as safe enough, or at least safe enough relative to the alternative of having nothing to eat. The bean, Vicia faba, the broad bean in its dried field form, was the legume that occupied the social position below the pea in the medieval hierarchy of the acceptable protein source, and the social position of the broad bean in medieval Europe was specifically associated with the poor and the penitential. The broad bean was the food of the poor because it grew on the poorest land, required the least management, yielded reliably even in bad years, and stored well. The specific combination of agricultural qualities that made it the crop of last resort, and therefore the food of the people for whom last resort was the regular option. The broad bean in dried form was harder, stronger flavored, and more aggressively productive of the flatulent consequences that the oligosaccharide sugars of the legume family produce than the pea. And the medieval dietary literature's consistent association of the broad bean with the crude, the inelegant, and the appropriate only for those whose robust constitutions could manage its effects was the class prejudice of the period expressed through the lens of the humoral medical theory. The lentil, lens culinaris, appeared more frequently in the Mediterranean regions of medieval Europe, where the climate supported its cultivation, and where the classical Roman tradition had established it as an acceptable component of the urban poor's diet. The lentil's specific advantage over the pea and the broad bean was its cooking time. The small, flat lentil required no soaking and cooked relatively quickly compared to the larger, denser legumes, making it the specific fast food legume of the medieval period, the protein source that could be in the pot and ready in an hour rather than the half day that the soaked field pea required. The chickpea, Cicer arietinum, was the legume of the southern European poor diet, present in the Spanish cocido and the Italian ribollita. and the various slow-cooked legume preparations of the Mediterranean peasant tradition. The chickpeas' combination of high protein content, pleasant nutty flavor, and good keeping quality made it a genuine dietary staple in the regions that could grow it, and its relative absence from the northern European medieval diet was the specific climatic limitation of the plant that needed the long, warm Mediterranean summer to produce its crop. The specific cooking techniques that the medieval poor developed for legumes were the techniques of the limited fuel supply, the long, slow cooking in a pot that required minimal fuel. Once the initial heat was established, the retained heat cooking that used the thermal mass of the clay pot to continue the cooking after the fire was reduced, the overnight soaking that shortened the cooking time and therefore reduced the fuel cost of the preparation. Each of these techniques reflected the specific constraint of the fuel as a cost. Wood was not free. The collection or the purchase of fuel was a real expenditure, and the cooking technique that minimized the fuel cost was the economically rational cooking technique for the household that was managing the fuel supply as carefully as the food supply. Chapter 4. The Foraged Foods. The wild plants that stood between the medieval poor and starvation. The forest was not a wilderness. The modern imagination of the medieval forest, the dark, untamed, dangerous space outside the village boundary, the place of wolves and outlaws, and the general menace of the uncontrolled natural world, is a projection of the Romantic period's specific mythology of nature, and it is almost entirely wrong about what the medieval forest meant to the medieval poor person. The medieval forest was not a wilderness. It was a resource. It was the specific, organized, legally regulated resource that the medieval poor person depended on for the supplementary foods that the difference between adequate nutrition and genuine malnutrition required. The forest provided nuts. The oak produced the acorn that the pigs converted into the pork that the household would slaughter at Martinmas, but also the acorn that the desperate household in the bad harvest year would grind into flour and leach, and cook into the specific bitter, dense bread that the acorn flour produced. The acorn bread was not the food of the adequately fed. It was the food of the household that had run short of grain, and was using what the forest provided to extend the stores until the next harvest. But it was food, and in the years when the grain stores ran out in February, the distinction between acorn bread and no bread was the distinction between the household that survived and the household that did not. The hazel produced nuts that required no processing. The hazelnut that the children gathered from the coppiced hazel stands in September, that stored through the winter in the dry condition that preserved them from mold, that provided fat and protein in the specific compact form of the nut that the human body could use directly. The hazelnut was not the poor person's starvation food. It was the pleasant, genuinely nutritious food that the forest offered as a reliable supplementary crop. And the archaeological evidence of hazelnuts at medieval poor household sites is the evidence of a food that was regularly and willingly consumed rather than the last resort of the desperate. The beech nut, the mast of the beech forest, was the nut that the good beech year produced in extraordinary quantities, the specific oil-rich seed of the beech tree that the pigs ate in preference to everything else, and that the human household ate as well when the mast year provided more than the pigs could consume. The beech mast year, the masting year of the beech forest, the specific irregular cycle in which the beech produced a massive seed crop every several years, was an event that organized the pastoral economy of the beech forest regions around its occurrence, and the human consumption of the beech mast in good years was the specific opportunistic eating of the medieval poor person, who understood that the forest's abundance, when it came, was to be consumed while it lasted. The mushroom was the forest's most reliable protein supplement, available through the late summer and autumn in the specific abundance that the good mushroom year produced, and the medieval poor person's knowledge of which mushrooms to eat and which to avoid was the accumulated knowledge of generations of experience with this specific food source. The mushroom knowledge was real knowledge. the ability to distinguish the CEP from the destroying angel, the field mushroom from the death cap, the chanterelle from the false chanterelle, acquired through the specific process of learning from experienced foragers and the specific consequences of getting it wrong that made the knowledge stick. The medieval forager was not the modern foraging enthusiast who does it for interest. The medieval forager was a skilled practitioner of a specific set of survival skills, whose accuracy was the difference between the evening's supplementary protein and the evening's accidental poisoning. The knowledge was taken seriously because the stakes were serious, and the transmission of that knowledge from the experienced household members to the children learning it was one of the specific educational processes of the medieval poor household that no schoolmaster oversaw and no text recorded, but that was as important as any other knowledge the household possessed. The greens were the forests and the common land's most consistent contribution to the medieval poor diet. The nettle, Urtica dioica, the stinging nettle that the modern English suburban gardener regards as a weed to be eradicated, was a genuine food crop that the medieval poor person harvested in spring as the first green of the year, the specific early spring timing of the nettle's growth, making it available at precisely the moment when the hungry gap was at its worst, and the body's need for the vitamins and minerals that the fresh green provided was most acute. The nettle was eaten boiled, the blanching that destroyed the sting rendering it palatable, or incorporated into the pottage in the way that any leafy green was incorporated into the pottage, wilting in the hot liquid and contributing its specific nutritional content to the finished dish. The nettle's nutritional profile is, from the modern nutritionist's perspective, genuinely impressive. High iron content, high calcium content, significant protein content for a leafy green, substantial vitamin C in the fresh spring growth. And the medieval poor person who ate nettles in spring was eating, by accident or by the accumulated experience of generations, one of the nutritionally better decisions available in that season. The sorrel, the wild sorrel, the sharp-tasting oxalic acid-containing leaf that grew in meadows and on the banks of streams, was the specific flavoring green of the medieval poor diet. The leaf that added the acidity to the pottage that the lemon or the vinegar provided in other traditions. The sorrel's tartness was a genuine culinary contribution, the acid that cut through the heaviness of the grain, and legume base that provided the contrast of flavor that the good cook understands is as important as the main flavor itself. The wild garlic, Allium ursinum, the ramsons that carpeted the damp woodland floor in spring, was the spring flavoring that the medieval poor person gathered in quantity before the cultivated alliums in the kitchen garden were ready, using the fresh, distinctly garlicky leaf in the pottage, and the bread and whatever other preparation required a flavoring. The wild garlic's intensity was different from the cultivated garlic bulbs, softer, more herbaceous, less pungent, but its availability at exactly the moment when the previous year's cultivated garlic was exhausted and the new crop was not yet harvested made it the specific bridge flavoring that the seasonal gap in the cultivated allium supply required. The watercress, Nasturtium officinale, growing in the cold, clean streams of the medieval countryside in abundance that the modern polluted watercourse cannot support, was the stream's contribution to the medieval diet, the specific green that the person with access to a clean, running water supply could gather in quantity, and that provided the specific combination of vitamins and minerals that the watercress's concentrated nutritional profile delivered. The watercress was not a luxury in the medieval world. It was a free food for anyone who lived near a stream, requiring no cultivation, no preparation beyond washing, and no cooking, and its contribution to the medieval poor person's diet in the hungry months of early spring was real and significant. The gathering of these wild foods was not the hobby of the interested. It was the specific economic activity of the household that understood its food supply in terms of every available source, and that could not afford to ignore any source that was free and nutritious. The child sent to gather nettles from the common land was the child performing a genuine economic task, contributing a real food product to the household's resources, and the knowledge of where the nettles grew and when they were at their best was the specific local knowledge that the child acquired as a natural part of growing up in the medieval landscape. The right of common, the specific legal entitlement of the villager to gather on the common land, to take wood and bracken, and the specific foods that the common produced, was not merely a convenience. It was the specific legal structure that made the supplementary diet of the medieval poor possible, and the enclosure of the common, when it came in the later medieval and early modern period, was experienced as the catastrophe that it was because the loss of the common was the loss of the supplementary food supply that the diet required. Chapter 5. The dairy. What milk, cheese, and eggs meant to the medieval poor household. The cow was not a pet. The single cow that the medieval peasant household maintained, when it could afford to maintain one, when the winter fodder situation permitted, when the specific economics of the household allowed the capital investment that the cow represented, was the most economically important animal on the holding after the ox that pulled the plow, and its importance was the importance of the food it produced rather than the sentimental attachment that the modern relationship with domestic animals implies. The cow's milk was the dairy product that the medieval poor household processed into every form that the preservation techniques available to it permitted. The fresh milk, drunk as the daily milk ration, or used in the pottage in the quantities that the day's milking produced, was the morning's nutrition for the children and the household. The milk that was not consumed fresh was processed into the forms that kept longer. The butter, the soft cheese, the hard cheese, because the specific fragility of the fresh milk in the warmth of the summer months made long-term storage in liquid form impossible, and the transformation into the more stable dairy products, the only way to preserve the summer's milk abundance through the winter. The butter making was the specific skilled labor of the medieval dairy woman, the churning of the cream that separated from the whole milk when it stood, the worked and salted butter that emerged from the churn after the specific time and effort that the churning required. The butter was salted for preservation, the salt that slowed the rancidification of the fat and extended the keeping time from days to weeks. And the salted butter was the specific form that the medieval poor household used as both a preservative and a condiment, the fat spread on the bread that improved the bread and simultaneously consumed the butter. The cheese was the dairy product that the medieval poor household depended on most heavily as the protein source from the dairy, because the cheese was the form in which the milk's protein was most concentrated and most durable. The soft, fresh cheese, the curds pressed and drained but not aged, was the everyday cheese of the poor household, made from the milk that the day's milking produced and eaten within the few days that it kept at the temperatures of the medieval kitchen. The hard, aged cheese, the cheese that the pressed, salted, and dried curd developed into over the weeks and months of the aging process, was the cheese that the household, with adequate milk and adequate time and adequate knowledge of the aging process, could produce as a genuine, long-keeping dairy product. The specific cheeses of the medieval poor tradition were not the named, prized cheeses of the great households. They were the unnamed, practical cheeses of the farm dairy, made from whatever milk was available and processed with the specific techniques that the local tradition had developed for that milk and that environment. The hard farm cheese of the autumn, made from the summer's surplus milk and aged through the autumn and winter, was the cheese that appeared in the household stores, inventories as a standard winter food. The goat was the poor person's cow, the smaller, cheaper, more manageable animal that the household, which could not afford the capital cost of the cow, could maintain instead, producing a smaller but still significant milk yield from the rough grazing and browse that the goat converted into food more efficiently than the cow. The goat milk was higher in fat and protein than cow milk, and the goat cheese that it produced was the specific sharp-flavored soft cheese that remains in the contemporary food world, the characteristic dairy product of the Mediterranean regions, where the goat was always the primary dairy animal. The egg was the medieval poor household's most flexible food ingredient, the product of the hen that pecked around the yard, eating the scraps and the insects and the grain that the threshing floor left behind, requiring minimal care and minimal additional feeding, and producing the specific high-protein, complete nutrition food that the egg provided on an almost daily basis. The egg was eaten boiled, fried in the pan fat, scrambled with the pottage, incorporated into the bread when the flour ran short and the egg could extend the dough, hard-boiled and carried to the field as the specific portable protein of the agricultural working day. The hen that produced the eggs was also the hen that, when her laying days were done, produced the tough, long-cooked meat of the old laying hen. The specific, intensely flavored, chewy unless cooked, slowly protein of the spent hen that the pottage accepted and transformed over the hours of its cooking into the tender, deeply flavored meat that the long-simmered hen becomes. The medieval poor household did not waste the old hen. The old hen went into the pot, and the pot made something worthwhile from her. The egg-free periods of the medieval year were the specific dietary challenge of the religious calendar. The Lenten fast, the Ember days, the various other fast days that the church imposed that prohibited not only meat, but also eggs and dairy. The strict Lenten fast of the medieval church applied fully, removed from the poor household's diet the specific foods, the eggs, the butter, the cheese, that were often the only animal protein sources available at that time of year, when the salt meat barrel was nearly empty and the new season's animals were not yet mature. The Lenten diet of the poor was the diet of the grain and the legume and the dried fish, if the household could afford dried fish, and the foraged greens that the early spring produced. It was, by the standards of modern nutrition, a reasonably adequate diet if the dried legumes and the grain were present in adequate quantity. But it was also a monotonous and unsatisfying diet. And the theological significance of the fast was not unrelated to the fact that for the poor household, the fast was a genuine dietary restriction rather than the spiritual exercise of the already well-fed. Chapter 6. The Preservation. How the autumn's abundance became the winter's sustenance. The slaughter was not brutal, it was practical. The Martinmas slaughter, the killing of the animals in November, around the feast of St. Martin, that the specific logic of the medieval agricultural year required, was the event that organized the late autumn's work, and that determined the quality of the winter's food. The animals that could not be fed through the winter on the available hay and fodder were killed at Martinmas, because the alternative was feeding them through the winter until they died of starvation in February in worse condition than they were in November, having consumed the fodder that the livestock that did survive would need. The calculation was the calculation of the experienced stockman who knew exactly how much hay the barn contained and exactly how many animals the barn's hay could sustain through the months until the spring grazing resumed. The animals above that number were killed. The calculation was not sentimental. The calculation was survival. The killing of the pig was the central event of the Martinmas slaughter in the average poor household, because the pig was the animal that the poor household was most likely to have maintained through the year. The specific animal whose combination of low maintenance cost, efficient conversion of scraps to meat, and high carcass yield made it the poor person's slaughter animal of choice. Across medieval Europe, the pig ate the slops, the scraps, the spoiled food, the acorns and the beech mast of the autumn forest floor, the whey left from the cheese-making, and everything else that the household produced that was not directly consumed, and it converted this eclectic diet into the pork fat and the protein of the pork muscle that the Martinmas slaughter revealed. The processing of the slaughtered pig was the total use operation that the specific economic conditions of the medieval poor household required. Nothing was wasted. The blood went into the black pudding, the blood sausage that the rendered fat and the grain and the spices filled out into the specific, rich, mineral-flavored product that used the blood before it spoiled. The offal was eaten immediately, cooked in the specific ways that the liver and the heart and the kidneys and the intestines required, because the offal spoiled faster than the muscle meat. and required the earliest processing. The muscle meat was preserved by salting, packed in the barrel with the dry salt, or submerged in the brine solution that the salt and water produced. The specific concentration of salt creating the chemical environment that suppressed the bacterial growth and preserved the meat through the months of the winter and the spring. The salt pork barrel was the winter's insurance, the specific food store that the household checked and calculated with the same anxious arithmetic that it applied to the grain store and the legume store. The salting required salt, and the salt was not free. The medieval salt trade, the specific movement of the essential preservative from the coastal salt pans and the inland salt springs to the inland regions that required it, was one of the more organized commercial operations of the medieval economy, because the demand for salt as a food preservative was constant and universal and not substitutable. The poor household that could not afford adequate salt for the Martinmas preservation faced the specific problem of the inadequately preserved meat, the meat that turned in the barrel before the winter was done, that had to be assessed each time the barrel was opened for whether it had kipped or spoiled, and that represented the loss of the autumn's investment if it spoiled. The smoking was the other preservation technique that the poor household applied to the meat and the fish, the cold smoking over the slow burning wood fire that drove the specific antimicrobial compounds of the wood smoke into the surface of the meat, creating the chemical barrier that slowed spoilage and also created the specific flavor of the smoked meat that the modern cook still produces by the same method. The smoked ham, the smoked fish, the smoked sausage. These are not the modern inventions of the artisanal food movement, but the ancient necessities of the household that needed to eat preserved protein through the winter. The fish, where the household had access to a fishable river or a coastal supply, or where the dried and salted fish of the commercial trade was affordable, was preserved by the combination of drying and salting that the specific products of the medieval fish trade required. The stockfish, the air-dried, unsalted cod of the Norwegian and Icelandic fisheries, was the preserved fish that traveled farthest and cheapest, the specific product of the cold, dry northern winds that desiccated the split cod without salt and produced a product of extraordinary keeping quality and extraordinary hardness. The reconstitution of the stockfish, the overnight soaking in cold water that the rock-hard, dried fish required to become edible, the specific process of rehydration that the experienced cook managed over the 12 to 24 hours of the soak was the standard preparation step for the medieval Lenten fish that the poor household could afford. The soaked stockfish had the specific texture of the reconstituted dried protein, slightly fibrous, slightly chewy, requiring the additional cooking of the long simmer to become fully palatable. And its flavor was the specific flavor of the dried and rehydrated cod that the modern cook encounters in the bacala of the Italian and Spanish culinary traditions, where the preservation technique has become the culinary tradition even in the era of the refrigerator. The vegetable preservation was the autumn operation that required specific knowledge and specific materials. The root vegetables, the turnip, the parsnip, the carrot, the beet, were stored in the cool, dark conditions of the root cellar, or the clamp, the specific cold storage environment that kept them dormant and preserved through the winter months. The clamp, the specific outdoor storage structure of the pile of roots covered with straw and earth, was the medieval household's root vegetable freezer, using the ground's thermal mass to maintain the cool, stable temperature that slowed the root's metabolism and kept it from either rotting in warmth or freezing in cold. The cabbage and the related brassicas were preserved by the specific lacto-fermentation technique that the medieval European tradition shared with the East Asian tradition. The salt-packed anaerobic fermentation of the shredded cabbage that produced the specific sour, preserved product that the modern world knows as sauerkraut. The lacto-fermented cabbage was not the medieval poor person's attempt to recreate a modern food. It was the specific practical application of the fermentation chemistry that the observed behavior of the salted packed cabbage produced, kept for the winter food supply, and providing the specific vitamin C content that the fermentation preserved while the cooking destroyed in the fresh vegetable. The preservation was the autumn's purpose, the specific transformation of the abundant perishable food of the harvest season into the stored, durable food of the winter months. The household that did the preservation well ate adequately through the winter. The household that did the preservation badly, or that had too little to preserve, or that lost the stored food to the rat, or the damp, or the unusually warm winter. That household experienced the hungry gap not as the merely difficult period of reduced rations, but as the potentially fatal situation of genuine food insecurity. The skills of the preservation were the skills that the household could not afford to lack. The knowledge of how much salt to use in the brine, of how dry the root vegetables needed to be before they went into the clamp, of how tightly to pack the salt pork in the barrel. This was practical, life-relevant knowledge, and its absence was not an inconvenience, but a catastrophe. The grandmother who knew the preservation knew the thing that kept the household alive, and her knowledge was worth more, in those specific terms, than any other knowledge the household possessed. Chapter 7. The ale, the medieval beverage that was also food. The ale was not a luxury, the specific misunderstanding of the medieval poor person's relationship to ale. The misunderstanding that the modern temperance tradition and the modern food history that occasionally inherits its moral framing has produced is the misunderstanding of the ale as the irresponsible expenditure of the poor on alcohol when they should have been buying bread. This is not what the ale was. The ale was food. It was a caloric beverage, a nutritional supplement, and the specific product of the grain that the brewing process transformed into a liquid form that provided the household's second most important caloric source after the bread. The medieval ale was not the ale of the modern pub. The medieval ale was brewed without hops, the hopped ale that the modern drinker knows, as ale, or beer, was the product of the late medieval introduction of the hop as a bittering and preserving agent, and the ale that the medieval English poor drank was the unhopped ale, brewed from the malted grain, and the water and the yeast, fermented to a low alcohol content, and consumed within the few days that the unhopped ale kept before souring. The specific flavor of the unhopped ale was sweet, slightly sour, yeasty, very different from the hoppy bitterness of the modern ale, much closer to the thin porridge of the fermented grain than to anything the modern pub sells. The malting of the grain, the process of germinating the grain to convert the stored starches to the fermentable sugars that the yeast could process, then kilning the germinated grain to stop the germination and dry the malt, was the specific preparation step that transformed the raw grain into the ale-making material. The malting required knowledge, time, and the controlled environment of the malting floor, where the grain was spread to germinate at the correct temperature and humidity. The household that malted its own grain was the household with the knowledge, the space, and the time for the malting operation. Many poor households purchased their malt from the maltster rather than malting their own. The ale-making itself was the alewife's domain, the specific brewing operation of the medieval household economy that women performed as a domestic and commercial activity, producing the ale for the household's consumption and selling the surplus to the neighbors and the passing trade. The alewife of the medieval English village was the specific economic agent of the local ale trade, the woman who brewed regularly, whose ale the ale conner tested for quality and proper measure, and whose income from the ale selling contributed to the household's cash economy in the specific way of the cottage industry that turned the domestic skill and the household's grain surplus into cash. The specific caloric contribution of the medieval ale was the caloric contribution of the grain's fermented sugars and the yeast's protein, and it was not negligible. The liter of medieval ale contained roughly 300 to 400 calories, a significant addition to the daily caloric total of the poor household that was chronically short of calories, consumed in the form of the beverage that was simultaneously safer than the water source, and more nutritious than the water source, and more palatable than the water source. The water of the medieval town or village was not reliably safe to drink. the specific bacterial content of the water source contaminated by the runoff from the midden and the pig pen and the privy and the various other sources of fecal contamination that the medieval settlement produced meant that the water, drunk unboiled, was the specific vehicle for the gastrointestinal diseases that the medieval poor experienced at high and chronic rates. The ale, brewed in water that had been boiled in the mashing process, with the subsequent fermentation adding the additional antimicrobial protection of the alcohol content, was the specific beverage that the poor household chose over the water, not out of the preference for intoxication, but out of the sound, empirically validated conclusion that the ale made you less sick than the water. The children drank the small ale, the very low alcohol content ale produced from the second running of the mash, the specific weak ale that the household made from the malt grain's second extraction after the stronger ale's wort had been drawn off. The small ale was the household's children's beverage, the specific thin, mildly fermented drink that provided the same bacteriological safety benefit of the ale without the alcohol content of the main brew. The medieval child raised on small ale was not the neglected child of the alcohol-addicted poor. They were the child whose parents had made the specific rational choice of the beverage that was safer than the alternative. The brewing was a social activity as well as an economic one. The communal brewing, the neighbors who combined their grain and their labor to produce a larger batch than any single household could manage alone, sharing the resulting ale and the working day of the brewing, was the specific form of the cooperative economic activity that the medieval poor household engaged in for the resource-intensive tasks that the individual household could not manage efficiently alone. The brewing day was a day of community as well as work, the shared labor producing the shared meal, and the shared drink that cemented the specific social relationships of the village. The ale house, the house where the alewife's ale stake, indicated that ale was available for sale and for consumption on the premises, was the specific social institution of the medieval village that the church disapproved of in the regular and consistent way that religious authorities disapprove of the popular social institutions that compete with their own community organizing function. The alehouse was not a den of vice. It was the village's warm, lit, social space, the place where the news was exchanged, the disputes were discussed, the marriages were arranged, the deals were struck, and the community performed the specific social functions that any community requires for its ongoing coherence. The ale gave the medieval poor person a social life, a safe beverage, a caloric supplement, and the specific comfort of the warm, fermented drink at the end of the working day that any honest account of human experience has to acknowledge as a genuine good. The medieval poor drank their ale, not because they were dissolute, but because it was food, because it was safe, and because it tasted better than cold water, and a life without any pleasure whatsoever. Chapter 8. The Feast Day. The one meal that made the whole year bearable. The feast was not excess. The modern reading of the medieval feast day, the specific image of the groaning table, the roasted meats, the elaborate subtleties in sugar and marzipan, the rivers of wine, and the general atmosphere of the Bruegel painting, turned into a dietary event, is the reading that takes the exceptional and treats it as representative. The feast of the great household, the feast of the chronicle, and the illuminated manuscript was the exception. The feast that the medieval poor person experienced was a different animal entirely. Smaller, more modest, more specifically meaningful in the way that the thing withheld and then granted is always more meaningful than the thing freely available. But it was real. It was the genuinely better meal that the feast day of the liturgical calendar permitted, and that the poor household scraped and planned and saved toward, in the specific way of the person who understands that the ordinary is only tolerable when the exceptional exists to interrupt it. The feast day meat was the central feature of the poor person's festival meal. The specific animal or the specific cut that appeared at the table on the days when the liturgical calendar permitted it and the household's economics had been managed carefully enough to make it possible. The chicken that spent most of the year as the egg layer came to the feast day table, as the roasted bird whose smell filled the house, in the specific way that the smell of roasting meat fills any space and signals something beyond the ordinary. The small pig that was not the primary Martinmas slaughter pig, but the younger animal, kept for precisely this purpose, the piece of bacon that had been saved from the barrel for the Christmas meal. The Christmas feast of the medieval poor was the specific annual event around which the entire autumn's careful management of resources had been organized. The meal that the saving of the slightly better piece of salted meat and the slightly more generous use of the winter stores produced, served on the specific day that the religious calendar designated as the one day of the year when the grimness of the ordinary was officially suspended. It was not the feast of the manor. It was the feast of the people who had worked all year for the manor, and its modest scale was not a diminishment of its significance, but precisely the source of its significance. The spices appeared on the feast day table, in the poor household, in the form of the tiny quantities that the occasional market purchase, or the careful gift from a better-off household had provided. The pepper, the ginger, the cinnamon, present not in the profligate quantities of the wealthy kitchen, but in the pinch and the scraping that the small investment of the feast day budget permitted. The spiced ale of Christmas, the warm, cinnamon and ginger-flavored ale that the ordinary ale became with the addition of the tiny quantity of spice that the household had saved for precisely this preparation, was the specific taste of medieval Christmas for the poor person who drank it, a taste so distinct from the ordinary ale that its mere aroma was the sensory signal that the feast had arrived. The feast day bread was white bread, or as close to white bread as the household's grain supply permitted. The sieving of the flour through the finest cloth the household possessed, the removal of as much bran as the sieve would separate, the production of the slightly lighter, slightly less sour loaf that the better processed flour produced. The white bread of the feast day was not the white bread of the wealthy. It was the household's best attempt at the white bread of the wealthy, produced from the same grain with more processing, and the specific small elevation of its quality over the ordinary daily bread was the visible, edible marker of the day's exceptional status. The feast was not excess. It was sufficiency, achieved once, which is not the same thing as excess, but is the thing that the chronically insufficient person most deeply understands as the specific form of good fortune that the world occasionally provides. The medieval poor person did not want to eat like the Lord every day. They wanted to eat enough every day and to eat well once or twice a year. And the liturgical calendar, whatever its theological dimensions, organized the year in a way that provided the specific social permission for the occasional good meal that the ordinary year denied. Chapter 9. The Market, where the medieval poor person bought what they could not grow. The market was not a supermarket. The specific transaction of the medieval poor person at the weekly market, the careful, calculated exchange of the small amount of cash that the household's minimal cash income had produced for the specific goods that the household's own production had failed to supply, was a transaction conducted under the constant pressure of the exact calculation of what was necessary versus what was merely desirable, and the specific skill of the market buyer, operating under tight constraints, was the skill of knowing precisely what they could and could not afford, and how to extract the maximum value from the transaction. The cash economy of the medieval poor was thin. The specific amount of money that the poor household had available for market purchases was the small amount produced by the sale of the surplus that the household occasionally had. The egg surplus of the good-laying year, the surplus grain of the better-than-average harvest, the small domestic crafts that the household members produced in the evenings by the fire. This cash was not discretionary income in the modern sense. It was the specific, carefully counted money that went toward the market purchases that the household's own production could not provide. The salt was the most essential market purchase, the preservation requirement that the household could not substitute or forgo, the specific mineral that the inland household produced none of and required in quantities that the year's preservation needs determined. The salt merchant's stall at the market was not a stall that the poor household browsed for interest. It was the stall they visited with the specific calculation of the pounds of salt that the Martinmas preservation required and the specific coins that amount would cost. The iron was the second essential market purchase, the specific metal that the household required for the tools and the pot repairs, and the various other metalwork needs that the iron-using agricultural life created. The blacksmith's work was not the luxury purchase of the comfortable household. The broken plow iron that could not be repaired was the broken plow iron that could not turn the field, that could not produce the grain that the household needed to eat. And the market's access to the smith's work was therefore the access to the continuation of the agricultural cycle that everything else depended on. The spices were the aspirational market purchase. The small quantity of pepper or ginger that the household bought, with whatever remained after the essential purchases were completed, in the quantity that the remaining coins permitted. The spice merchant at the market was the stall that the poor person visited last, with the least money, and bought from in the smallest quantities. The pennyworth of pepper that lasted the season, measured into the corner of a cloth, and carried home with the specific care of the expensive small purchase. The market was also the place where the information traveled. The news of the failed harvest in the neighboring region that would drive the grain price up before the winter. The information about the labor market in the town that the young person considering leaving the village needed, the gossip and the legal information and the social news that the medieval village assembled at the weekly market in the way that the online community assembles in the digital equivalent. The market was the medieval internet, and the poor person who attended it regularly was the person who was best informed about the specific economic and social conditions that their decisions needed to account for. The price fluctuation of the medieval market was the specific anxiety of the medieval poor household's market relationship. The grain price that doubled in the bad harvest year, transforming the ordinary market purchase into an impossible expenditure. The salt price that rose when the trade routes were disrupted by the specific conflicts and the specific weather events that the medieval transport system could not manage. The poor household had no buffer against the price rise, no savings, no alternative sources, no ability to wait for the price to come down. The market price on the day was the price they paid, or the thing they went without. The going without was not always possible. The salt, without which the meat could not be preserved, was not optional in the way that the spice was optional. The market failure, the specific failure of the market to provide at an accessible price the specific goods that the household required, was the economic catastrophe that pushed the marginal household over the edge into the crisis that the poor law and the monastic charity were designed inadequately to address. Chapter 10. The Hungry Gap, the specific terror of late winter and early spring. The Hungry Gap was not a metaphor. The specific period between the exhaustion of the winter stores and the arrival of the first spring crops, the weeks of late February, March, and April when the grain sack was empty or nearly empty. The root vegetable cellar was down to the last sorry specimens. The salt pork barrel had yielded its last adequate piece, and the spring had not yet produced anything from the ground. Was the period that the medieval agricultural economy most feared, and that the agricultural calendar organized itself in its entirety to prepare against and survive. The Hungry Gap was a structural feature of the pre-industrial food system, not an anomaly. Every year, the winter stores ran down at approximately the same rate, and every year, the spring crops arrived at approximately the same time, and the gap between the two was the Hungry Gap. The weeks when the household was eating below its requirements, rationing what remained, and waiting for the spring to provide the first supplement to the diminishing stores. The specific foods of the Hungry Gap were the foods that the spring provided earliest: the nettle shoots of March, the sorrel of April, the first eggs of the hens whose laying had slowed through the short winter days and was now increasing again as the daylight lengthened, the first milk of the dairy cow that had dried off in November and was freshening again in spring. These were not adequate substitutes for the full diet of the autumn. They were the first signs that the gap was ending, the specific early spring foods that supplemented the inadequate stores as the stores ran toward empty. The mortality of the hungry gap was real. The specific increase in death rates in the late winter and early spring that the demographic record of the medieval period shows, the spike in the burial records of February and March that appears consistently across the medieval centuries, was the hungry gap's death toll, not mass starvation usually. The occasional catastrophic famine was a different and worse thing, but the specific increase in the vulnerability of the already weakened body to the infections and the cold, and the general attrition of the depleted immune system that the months of caloric insufficiency had produced. The old died first, the very young died second. The people who had been sick in the autumn and had never fully recovered died third. The specific demographic pattern of the hungry gap mortality was the mortality of the already vulnerable, the bodies that the months of reduced rations had left with the least reserve to resist the specific insults of the late winter. The healthy adult in the prime of their working life survived the hungry gap. They survived it hungry, weakened, slower in thought and body than they would be after the spring's food improved the situation, but they survived. The management of the hungry gap was the management of the winter stores, the specific arithmetic of November's stores, divided by the number of mouths, divided by the number of weeks to the spring's first supplement. The household that did this calculation carefully in November was the household that was hungry in March, but not starving. The household that failed the calculation, that ate more freely in December in the false confidence of the abundant-seeming barrel and the well-stocked grain sack, was the household that ran out in February and faced the specific terror of the stores reduced to nothing with weeks of winter remaining. The sharing of food in the hungry gap was both the ethical requirement that the community imposed on its members and the specific survival mechanism that the village's social organization provided. The household that had managed the winter well and had stores remaining in March was the household that shared with the household that had not out of the specific generosity of the individually virtuous, but out of the community's collectively understood calculation that the alternative to sharing was the death of neighbors who would be needed in the spring's plowing and planting. The hungry gap was the test that the medieval agricultural year administered annually, and the household's preparation for it, survival through it, and emergence from it was the specific rhythm of the medieval poor person's year. The first green thing of spring was not a culinary curiosity. It was the end of the test. It was the beginning of the part of the year when eating enough was possible again. Chapter 11. The Children's Food. What medieval children actually ate. The medieval child was not a small adult. The specific understanding of the medieval attitude toward childhood, the understanding that the medieval period did not recognize childhood as a distinct developmental phase, did not provide childhood with its own specific foods, its own specific protections, its own specific status, has been revised significantly by the historiography of the past several decades. And the revision matters for the food history because the actual diet of the medieval child was more specifically adapted to the child's situation than the older historiography suggested. The medieval child's food began with breast milk, the specific infant nutrition that the medieval medical tradition recognized as the correct first food, and that the medieval mother provided, when she was able, for the first year or two of the child's life. The wet nurse, the woman hired by the wealthier household to nurse the child in the mother's place, was the specific institution of the wealthy, and the poor household's child was nursed by its own mother as a matter of economic necessity as much as maternal inclination. The weaning was the specific transition point that the medieval child's food history turned on. The moment when the breast milk was replaced by the soft, grain-based foods that the household could provide and that the infant's digestive system was being trained to process. The PAP, the grain gruel of the fine ground grain cooked in milk or water. to the specific smooth consistency that the infant without teeth could swallow. Was the weaning food the first solid food in the specific sense of the food that was not liquid, but that required no chewing? The medieval pap was not nutritionally adequate as a sole diet. It lacked the fat content, the protein density, and the vitamin and mineral profile that the growing infant required. The medieval infant mortality statistics reflect in part the specific inadequacy of the weaning diet that replaced the nutritionally complete breast milk with the nutritionally incomplete grain gruel. The children who survived weaning onto the PAP were the children whose immune systems and whose constitution were robust enough to compensate for the specific nutritional deficiencies of the early post-weaning diet. The older child ate from the common pot. The household pottage that the family shared served in the smaller portion that the child's smaller body required and in the softer preparation that the child's fewer and less developed teeth could manage. The pottage of the medieval poor household was naturally child-appropriate in its texture. The long-cooked grain and the long-cooked legumes of the 3-hour pottage were soft enough for the child with incomplete dentition to manage without the specific food modification that the modern child's diet requires. The bread for the child was the soaked bread, the specific preparation of the older bread, soaked in ale or milk, or the pottage liquid that softened it to the consistency that the child's teeth could manage. The bread soup was the medieval child food, in precisely the way that the modern processed baby food is the modern child food, the specific form of the household's staple food adapted to the physical constraints of the developing child's capacity to eat it. The child's ale was the small ale, the weak, fermented beverage of minimal alcohol content that the household brewed from the second mash running. The specific bacteriological rationale for giving children the fermented rather than the unfermented water was the same rationale that applied to adults, and the child raised on small ale was the child whose household had made the specific practical calculation of the beverage safety rather than the sentimental decision of the modern parent who provides water because water seems more appropriate for children. The specific food reward of the medieval child was the sweet thing, the honey on the bread, the dried fruit in the rare circumstances of the feast preparation, the specific sweetness that the ordinary diet almost entirely lacked, and that the child's taste preference for sweetness registered as the exceptional treat. The medieval child's relationship to sweetness was the relationship of the person for whom sweetness was genuinely rare, not the modern child's relationship to the pervasive sweetness of the food environment that makes sugar a background condition rather than a reward. The medieval child who helped in the food production, who gathered the nettles, who tended the geese, who collected the eggs, who carried the water, was participating in the household food system in a way that gave them the specific knowledge of where food came from and what it cost in labor that the modern child who takes the food from the refrigerator does not have. The medieval child knew that the egg was the product of the hen, and the hen was the product of the feed, and the feed was the product of the field, and the field was the product of the labor. And this knowledge was the specific food literacy of the person who is embedded in the food system, rather than the end consumer of it. Chapter 12. The sick person's food. How the medieval poor household fed its ill. The sick person could not eat the ordinary meal. This was not the figurative sensitivity of the person whose appetite had been reduced by illness, though that was also true. It was the specific physical reality of the person with the gastrointestinal illness, the person with the fever, the person recovering from the injury that had laid them up for a week, all of whom required the specific adapted diet that the medieval medical tradition recognized as the appropriate food for the compromised body, and that the household produced with the resources it had. The gruel was the sick person's food, the specific, thin, easily digestible preparation of the grain and water that required the least digestive effort from the body, and that provided the hydration and the minimal calories that the sick person needed to survive the illness. The medieval gruel was not the punishment of the workhouse imagination. It was the specific clinical diet of the person whose body could not manage the full pottage's fiber content and density, the specific light preparation that the experienced medieval cook knew to produce for the household member who was unwell. The oat gruel was the specific sick person's preparation that the Northern European tradition favored. The oats cooked in water to the thin, smooth consistency of the broth, rather than the thick consistency of the porridge, strained of the grain solids through the cloth that the straining required, producing the specific clear, starchy liquid that the sick person could consume without the solid food's digestive demands. The medieval sickroom gruel was the medieval version of the clear liquid diet that the modern hospital still prescribes for the post-surgical patient and the acutely ill. The beef or chicken broth, where the household had the specific bones and the scraps to make it, was the specific restorative that the medieval medical tradition prescribed for the person recovering from illness, and its prescription was empirically sound in ways that the medieval physician explaining it through the humoral theory could not fully articulate, but that the modern nutritionist can confirm. The long-simmered bone broth provided the collagen, the glycine, the minerals, and the specific compounds that the recovering body required in the specific easily absorbed form that the liquid preparation delivered directly to the depleted system. The medical advice of the medieval period on the sick person's diet was recorded in the vernacular health guides, the regimens sanitatis, the health handbooks that the medieval medical tradition produced for the literate household, and its recommendations were a mixture of the humoral medical theory's specific dietary prescriptions, which were sometimes useful and sometimes not, and the accumulated practical wisdom of centuries of caring for sick people with the specific foods that observation had established as helpful. The egg was the sick food. So, the soft-boiled egg, the poached egg, the lightly cooked egg white that the medieval sick person's diet included as the specific easily digestible protein that the recovering body could use without the digestive challenge of the tougher proteins. The egg appeared in the sick person's diet across every social level because the egg's specific combination of digestibility and nutritional completeness made it the obvious choice for the body that needed nutrition in its most accessible form. The honey in warm water was the medieval sick person's beverage. The specific sweet, warm drink, whose honey content provided easy calories, and whose antimicrobial properties the medieval household knew empirically as the property of honey that kept wounds from festering and kept the stored honey from spoiling. The honey water was the medieval sports drink, the calorie and mineral replacement for the person who had been sweating through a fever and needed the specific replenishment that the illness had depleted. The sick person's food in the medieval poor household was the food of the household's best effort within the household's limited means. The gruel made from the good oats reserved for the purpose, the egg from the laying hen, the honey from the hive, kept precisely in part for the medicinal uses that the medical tradition prescribed. The care of the sick in the medieval poor household was not the systematic clinical care of the hospital. It was the specific, attentive, resource-constrained care of the household that understood the person's recovery in terms of the food it could provide and the knowledge it had accumulated about what the sick body needed. The specific tenderness of the sick person's food, the extra attention, the finer preparation, the reserved ingredient used for the ill household member rather than the ordinary one, was the medieval household's specific expression of care in the language of food. The pot that simmered a little longer, the gruel that was strained a little more carefully, the egg that was saved from the ordinary use for the person who needed it most. These were not mere cooking operations. They were the acts of care that the food-centered economy of the medieval household expressed in the only currency it readily had. Chapter 13. The spice question. Why the medieval poor cooked with flavor, even when they had almost nothing. The spice was not the point. The specific obsession of the food history enthusiast with the medieval spice trade. The nutmeg and the cinnamon and the pepper traveling the specific distances from the Spice Islands and the Indian subcontinent to the tables of the European wealthy, the fortunes made, and the wars fought, and the continents accidentally discovered in the pursuit of the specific flavoring ingredients that the wealthy European kitchen demanded, has produced the specific misunderstanding of the medieval poor person's relationship to flavor that the spice-centered narrative always produces. The misunderstanding is this: that flavor in the medieval period was the property of the wealthy, available only to those who could afford the imported aromatics, and that the poor person's food was therefore flavorless food. The gray pottage, the dark bread, the boiled legumes, the whole catalog of the grim and the tasteless. This is wrong. It is wrong in a way that requires some specific correction, because the correction changes everything about how we understand the medieval poor person's experience of eating. The medieval poor person's kitchen was not a flavorless kitchen. It was a kitchen whose flavoring palette was entirely different from the wealthy kitchen's palette, assembled from the specific ingredients that the kitchen garden produced and the common land provided, and the local environment made available, rather than from the market's expensive imported goods. The flavor was real. The ingredients were cheap. The results, within their specific tradition, were genuinely good. The onion was the foundation of the poor person's flavor, the specific, powerful, sweet, savory flavor base that the allium family provided in its various cultivated and wild forms. The onion, cooked long and slow in the fat, developed the specific deep sweetness of the caramelized allium that every culinary tradition that has access to the onion has discovered independently as the foundation flavor of the savory kitchen. The French onion soup, the Indian curry's fried onion base, the Italian sofrito. All of these are the same discovery, that the onion, given heat and time, produces the most reliable, most complex, most universally appealing, savory flavor base that the cheap ingredient provides. The medieval poor person's pottage was built on this discovery, made not as a culinary innovation, but as the accumulated practical knowledge of the generations who had cooked with onions long enough to understand what heat and time did to them. The leek was the onion's companion in the medieval poor kitchen. The specific allium that the kitchen garden grew in the same bed as the onion, that the winter kept in the ground until it was needed, that went into the pottage with the onion, and contributed the specific milder, slightly grassy flavor that the leek added to the onion's sweetness. The leek soup of Wales, the cockaleekie of Scotland, the various leek preparations of the Celtic and Northern European culinary tradition. All of these are the poor person's flavoring tradition dressed in the national costume of the specific region, but the leek in every case is doing the same thing it did in the medieval pottage pot, providing the cheap, reliable, genuinely good flavor that the allium family delivers. The herbs of the kitchen garden were the poor person's spice rack, the specific fragrant plants that the medieval household cultivated in the small garden plot adjacent to the house, and that provided the flavoring palette of the everyday cooking, the thyme and the savory, and the marjoram, and the lovage, and the parsley. These were not the luxury ingredients of the wealthy kitchen. They were the free ingredients of the household that had taken the minimal trouble to grow them, and their contribution to the flavor of the pottage and the bread and the ale was the contribution of genuinely good aromatic herbs whose quality the modern cook with access to the fresh herb garden fully recognizes. The lovage deserves specific attention because it is the herb that the modern kitchen has most completely forgotten, and that the medieval poor kitchen used most extensively as the cheap flavoring that tasted most intensely of something expensive. The lovage leaf, the large celery-scented, intensely aromatic leaf of the Levisticum officinale plant that grew to waist height in the kitchen garden with minimal care, tasted strongly of the specific combination of celery and parsley and something deeper that the modern cook associates with the long-simmered stock. The medieval poor person who added lovage to the pottage was adding the flavor of the rich meat stock to the meatless pottage. The specific aromatic deception of the herb that made the cheap preparation taste more substantial than its ingredients warranted. This was not an accident. This was the specific culinary intelligence of the person who had discovered that the lovage, made the plain pottage taste better, and had kept growing lovage ever since. The mustard was the medieval poor person's condiment, the specific, sharp, pungent sauce made from the ground mustard seed that grew wild and cultivated across the European landscape, requiring no import and no significant expense. The mustard seed, ground with vinegar or the verjuice of the unripe grape or the crab apple, produced the specific, fierce, nose-clearing condiment that the medieval poor person used to make the salt pork more interesting and the bold bread more edible. The mustard was not the refined Dijon of the modern French table. It was the coarse, strong, immediate mustard of the household that had ground it fresh that morning, and its specific intensity was the flavor impact that the limited ingredient meal required to lift it from the adequate to the memorable. The vinegar, the wine vinegar where the grape was available, the cider vinegar of the apple regions, the ale vinegar of the northern household that had no grapes and whose ale occasionally turned in the barrel, was the poor person's acid flavoring, the specific sharpness that cut through the heaviness of the grain and fat diet, and provided the contrast that made the meal more than a single undifferentiated flavor. The vinegar on the bread, the vinegar in the pottage, the vinegar as the specific preservative and flavoring of the pickled vegetables. These were the applications of the cheap acid that the medieval poor kitchen used with the specific knowledge of the cook, who understood that the flavor contrast of the acid against the fatty and the starchy was the technique that transformed the plain into the interesting. The wild plants contributed flavor as well as nutrition. The peppery nasturtium leaf, the sharp sorrel, the anise-scented fennel that grew on the wasteland and the roadsides of the medieval landscape, the elderflower that flavored the early summer ale, and the elderberry that darkened and sharpened the autumn's preserves. The medieval forager who gathered these plants was gathering flavor as well as food, and the specific knowledge of which wild plant contributed, which flavor and how to use it, was the specific culinary knowledge of the person who understood their local environment as a flavoring resource rather than merely a visual backdrop. The poor person's kitchen was not the wealthy kitchen. It was not the spiced, elaborated, technically refined kitchen of the great household with its trained cook and its imported ingredients. It was a different kitchen, smaller, simpler, built from different materials, but it was a kitchen with genuine flavor, genuine technique, and the genuine culinary intelligence of the people who had spent their lives understanding it. The spice was not the point. The flavor was the point, and the flavor was there. Chapter 14. The leftovers. How the medieval poor kitchen wasted absolutely nothing. The leftover was not a leftover. The specific concept of the leftover, the food remaining from a previous meal that sits in the refrigerator accumulating guilt and eventually gets thrown away, is a concept that only makes sense in the food culture of abundance, the food culture where the next meal is so certain and so accessible that the previous meal's remnants become an embarrassment rather than a resource. The medieval poor kitchen did not have this problem. The medieval poor kitchen did not have the leftover in the modern sense because the medieval poor kitchen did not have the abundance that makes leftovers possible in the first place. And every remnant of every meal was the specific, valued beginning of the next meal, rather than the inconvenient surplus of the current one. The pottage pot was never empty. This was not a metaphor. It was the specific reality of the medieval poor household's cooking practice. The pot that was never scraped clean because the scraping was unnecessary when the next meal's ingredients were going into the same pot, over the same fire, before the current meal's residue had fully cooled. The pottage that remained in the pot at the end of the evening was the flavor base of the morning's pottage, the concentrated, long-cooked residue of the day's cooking that the fresh water and the fresh ingredients joined to produce the next day's meal with the specific depth of flavor that the accumulated cooking of the previous batches had built into the pot's contents. The bread that went stale was not wasted bread. It was the specific ingredient of the bread soup, the panade, the thickened pottage that the old bread produced when it was added to the liquid and allowed to soften and dissolve into the cooking medium. The stale bread added to the pottage was doing two things simultaneously. It was being consumed before it became fully inedible, and it was thickening the pottage in the specific way that the dissolved starch of the bread produced, the body and the texture that the plain-grain pottage sometimes lacked, and that the old bread provided as a free thickener. This was not the desperate improvisation of the starving. It was the specific practical cooking technique of the experienced cook who understood the stale bread as an ingredient rather than a waste product. The fat that remained in the pan after the occasional frying, the dripping, the rendered lard, the small puddle of cooking fat that the used pan contained, was collected into the specific container that every medieval poor kitchen maintained for the purpose, the fat collection vessel that accumulated the cooking fat over the days and weeks until there was enough to use again. The dripping pot was the medieval poor kitchen's fat reserve, the specific resource that the careful cook maintained by the consistent practice of saving what the careless cook threw away. The fat was flavor. The fat was calories. The fat was the specific ingredient that the poor kitchen was most consistently short of, and that the dripping pot extended into adequacy. The cooking water was never poured away. The specific liquid that the vegetables had cooked in, that the grain had simmered in, that the legumes had softened in. This liquid was the pottage's stock, the free flavoring that the cooking process had produced, and that the experienced cook recognized as the specific resource that the inexperienced cook discarded. The water that the turnips had cooked in tasted of turnips. The water that the onions had softened in tasted of onions. These were not neutral liquids to be disposed of. They were the flavored cooking media that the next preparation could use as its starting liquid, building the flavor complexity of the new dish from the flavor legacy of the previous one. The bread trencher, the specific piece of stale bread that served as the plate for the better-off household's meal, absorbing the juices and the sauces of the food placed on it, was eaten after the meal was done, either by the person who had dined on it or by the household's animals, or given to the poor who waited at the gate of the wealthy establishment for precisely this purpose. The trencher was the medieval disposable plate, but it was disposable in the specific sense of being consumed rather than thrown away. The specific difference between the food culture that finds secondary uses for everything and the waste culture that disposes of everything after its primary use. The animal was consumed entirely. The pig slaughtered at Martinmas produced not a portion of edible meat. Surrounded by waste, it produced the blood for the black pudding, the fat for the rendering and the cooking, the intestines for the sausage casing, the ears and the feet for the long-simmered preparations that extracted the gelatin and the flavor from the collagen-rich extremities, the liver and the heart, and the kidneys for the immediate consumption of the slaughter day, the bones for the stock pot, and the bristles for the brushes that the household used. The specific total use processing of the slaughtered animal was the application of the same principle to the meat supply that the poor kitchen applied to everything else. The principle that in the economy of scarcity, the thing has as many uses as the imagination and the knowledge of the user can find for it. The apple that was beginning to turn, not yet rotted, but softening at a rate that made the next week's eating uncertain, was the apple that went into the pot as the specific sweet component of the savory preparation, the apple sauce that accompanied the salt pork, the apple added to the pottage for the specific sweetness and acidity that the cooking apple contributed, the dried apple ring that the careful housewife produced from the excess of the harvest by slicing and stringing the fruit and hanging it in the warm air above the fire to desiccate into the keeping form that would last through the winter. The turning apple was not the ruined apple. It was the apple requiring immediate processing, and the knowledge of what to do with it immediately was the specific knowledge of the cook who wasted nothing. The herb that was going to flower, the specific stage of the herb plant's growth cycle at which the leaf became smaller and more intensely flavored, and the plant's energy was moving toward the seed production, was the herb that the experienced gardener harvested at this specific moment for. The drying that would preserve it through the winter, The dried herb bundles hanging from the ceiling of the medieval kitchen were not decorative. They were the winter's flavoring supply, the specific herbs at their peak. Intensity dried at the moment before they would have passed their useful stage and preserved for the months when the fresh herb was unavailable. The timing of the harvest was the specific knowledge of the experienced herb gardener, and the herb harvested a week too late, having flowered and gone to seed, was the herb that was partially wasted. The waste management of the medieval poor kitchen was, by the standards of modern sustainability discourse, a model of the zero-waste philosophy that the modern food movement aspires to. Not because the medieval poor were environmentally conscious in the modern sense, but because the specific economic conditions of the medieval poor kitchen made the waste of any food resource, the specific immediate loss of a resource, that could not easily be replaced. The modern kitchen's waste of food is the waste of the food system's abundance. The medieval kitchen's avoidance of waste was the avoidance of the food system's specific felt daily scarcity. The leftover was not a leftover. It was the next meal. And the next meal. The specific meal that the today's remnants and the tomorrow's fresh ingredients and the specific knowledge of the cook who understood how to combine them would produce was the meal that kept the household alive, nourished, and functional for another day. In the medieval poor kitchen, nothing ended. Everything continued. Chapter 15. The Memory of Food. Why the medieval poor person's cooking never left us. The recipe was never written down. This is the specific loss that the history of cheap medieval food has to reckon with honestly before it can make any claim to completeness. The specific, irretrievable loss of the knowledge that was never recorded because the people who held it were not the people who wrote things down, and the people who wrote things down were not the people who cooked the pottage. The cookbooks of the medieval period, the Forme of Curie, the Viandier, the various recipe collections that the scribes of the great households produced for the great households, are the cookbooks of the wealthy kitchen, written by the cook of the Lord's establishment for the Lord's establishment, recording the preparations that the Lord's kitchen produced for the Lord's table, and containing almost nothing of the everyday food of the majority of the population that the Lord's establishment was surrounded by and dependent on. The pottage recipe does not appear in the Forme of Curie, because the person commissioning the form of Curie already knew everything about pottage that they considered worth knowing. It was not their food, it was not their kitchen, and its documentation was not their concern. The food that the record preserves is always the food of the person controlling the record. And in the medieval period, the person controlling the record was not the peasant woman stirring the pot. But the recipe, unwritten, did not disappear. It traveled by the specific route of all unwritten knowledge, from hand to hand, from mouth to mouth, from the experienced cook showing the learning cook, from the grandmother demonstrating to the granddaughter watching, from the neighbor tasting and asking and being told. The knowledge traveled in the specific form of the accumulated practice of the people who used it daily, embedded in the muscle memory of the hand that knew how thick the pottage should be, and in the nose of the cook who knew when the bread was ready, and in the eye of the alewife who knew when the fermentation was complete. This is not a romantic description. It is the accurate description of how practical culinary knowledge travels through time in the absence of the written record, and the specific resilience of this transmission method is proven by the fact that it worked, that the pottage of the medieval period and the peas porridge of the early modern period and the split pea soup of the modern kitchen are the same dish, evolved through the specific transmission of the unwritten recipe across the centuries, arriving in the modern kitchen recognizably descended from the medieval pot. The specific foods of the medieval poor that survived into the modern kitchen survived not because they were documented, but because they were eaten continuously. Because the poverty that required them did not end with the medieval period, because the specific combination of cheap ingredients and specific techniques that the medieval poor developed continued to be the combination that the poor of every subsequent century reached for when they needed to feed people with very little. And because each generation of poor cooks learned the same food from the previous generation of poor cooks in the specific unbroken chain of the unwritten recipe, the cassoulet of the French Southwest, the specific slow-cooked bean and meat preparation of the Languedoc region, is the medieval poor person's legume pottage, dressed in the regional identity of the specific place where it was continuously cooked from the medieval period to the present. The ribollita of Tuscany, the twice-cooked bread and bean soup, whose name means literally the reboiled, is the medieval practice of the reheated pottage with the old bread dissolved in it, surviving in the specific Italian culinary tradition not as a museum piece, but as a genuinely loved everyday food. The Irish colcannon, the mashed potato and kale preparation of the Irish poor, is the medieval grain and brassica combination translated into the post-Columbian ingredients of the potato-eating centuries. The same logic of the starchy base and the available green applied to the New World ingredients that the Old World poor had adopted. These are not coincidences. They are the specific evidence of the continuous thread, the unbroken line of the poor person's cooking knowledge transmitted through the generations, adapting its ingredients to whatever the available cheap food of the specific time and place provided, but maintaining the specific techniques and the specific logic of the limited ingredient kitchen across the centuries and the continents. The medieval poor person's cooking knowledge is in the modern kitchen right now. It is in every home cook who makes a soup from the week's vegetable scraps rather than buying stock. In every household that soaks the dried beans overnight and cooks them long and slow. In every baker who maintains a sourdough starter and times the proving by the smell and the feel of the dough rather than the clock. These are the medieval techniques, not as historical reenactment, but as the living practice of the kitchen that understands the specific wisdom of the method that has worked for 1,000 years. The memory of food is the longest memory that the human species maintains. The specific taste of the bread that the grandmother made, the specific smell of the cooking that the childhood home produced. These sensory memories are among the most durable and the most emotionally freighted that the human brain stores, surviving into the late stages of cognitive decline when other memories have gone, persistent in the specific way of the deeply encoded early experience. The medieval poor person whose grandmother had made the pottage a specific way remembered that pottage, its specific smell, its specific consistency, the specific way the grandmother had added the herbs at the end. And when that person made pottage for their own household, they made it in the way they remembered, transmitting the specific knowledge in the specific sensory form in which they had received it. The food memory was the archive. The kitchen was the library. The cooking was the act of reading. The specific tragedy of the enclosure, the dispossession, the forced migration, the famine, the plantation, every historical event that broke the continuity of the poor community's occupation of the specific land that their food knowledge was embedded in, was partly a culinary tragedy, the specific loss of the food knowledge that was tied to the specific place, the wild garlic that grew in the specific wood, the mushroom meadow that the family had harvested for generations, the stream where the watercress grew in the specific bend where the current slowed. These were not merely landscape features, they were the specific locations of the food knowledge that the dispossessed community carried in their heads and lost when they lost the land. The diaspora cuisines of the dispossessed carry this loss and this continuity simultaneously. The food that the displaced community made from the new land's ingredients in the specific way of the old land's techniques, the cooking that was simultaneously the adaptation to the new circumstance, and the specific act of cultural memory that insisted on the continuity of the old. The Irish American who makes soda bread in Boston is doing what the Irish grandmother in County Clare did with the available flour and the buttermilk, and the specific difference in the ingredients and the specific sameness in the technique is the exact form that the diaspora food memory takes. Imperfect continuity, which is the only kind of continuity that the human community in motion ever achieves. The medieval poor person's food is our food, not in the specific sense of the historical recreation, not in the sense that the modern cook should attempt to reproduce the specific conditions of the medieval kitchen, the clay pot over the open fire, the grain ground on the household quern, the water carried from the well, in the specific sense that the techniques and the logic and the accumulated intelligence of the limited ingredient kitchen that the medieval poor developed are the foundation on which every subsequent tradition of feeding people cheaply and well has been built. The slow cook, the legume soak, the sourdough fermentation, the total use animal, the seasonal preservation, the herb garden, the fat collection, the bread soup, the reheated pottage that is better the second day. These are the medieval poor person's contributions to the human culinary tradition. The specific gifts of the people whose names were not recorded and whose food was not considered worth documenting, and who nevertheless fed the world. The recipe was never written down, but it survived anyway, because the food that keeps people alive has a way of being remembered by the people it kept alive, passed forward through the hands of every generation that needed it, arriving in the present not as history, but as dinner, the specific, daily, continuing miracle of the knowledge that refused to be lost because the people who held it could not afford to lose it. That is the history of cheap food. That is the history of most food. That is, in the end, the history of us. Conclusion: the intelligence of the empty larder. The medieval poor did not eat badly because they did not know better. This is the conclusion that the entire history of cheap medieval food points toward, and it is the conclusion that requires the specific effort of the imagination that good history always requires. The effort of understanding a past situation on its own terms, rather than the terms of the present looking backward. The medieval poor ate as well as they could with what they had. And what they had, in the hands of the people who had spent their entire lives learning to use it, produced food of genuine quality. The pottage of the long-simmered grain and legume that the 7 hours of the slow fire had developed into something deep and savory and sustaining. The bread of the sourdough tradition, whose fermentation the baker understood through experience rather than microbiology. The preserved foods of the autumn, whose specific techniques produced the salt pork and the hard cheese, and the fermented cabbage that the winter required. The intelligence of the empty larder was the specific intelligence of constraint. Every cuisine in history that has produced something genuinely interesting has produced it under the pressure of limitation. The Italian cucina povera that turned the offal, and the stale bread, and the dried beans into the specific dishes that the world now pays restaurant prices to eat. The French cassoulet that began as the poor person's bean pot and became the canonical dish of the Southwest. The Indian dal that is the everyday protein of the billion-person subcontinent, and also one of the genuinely great dishes of the world's culinary heritage. The best food is almost never the food of unlimited resources. It is the food of the specific, intelligent, creative response to the limited resources. The medieval poor person was the specific practitioner of this intelligence, not recognized as such, not celebrated as such, living in conditions that the modern world rightly considers unjust and inadequate, but nonetheless applying the specific culinary knowledge of their tradition to the specific ingredients of their situation, and producing the specific results that kept them alive and fed. The pottage fed the plowing, the bread sustained the harvest, the ale refreshed the laborer and protected the child from the contaminated water. The salt pork carried the household through February. The foraged nettle provided the iron in March, when the stores were at their lowest. The dried pea gave the protein that the muscle required for the work that the season demanded. The feast day chicken made the year's monotony bearable and gave the children the specific memory of the good meal that they would recall when they were old and the feast day came around again. The medieval food system was not a good system. It was a system of systematic deprivation organized around the extraction of the labor of the majority for the benefit of the minority, and the specific genius of the poor people's cooking that it produced was the genius of necessity rather than the genius of choice. The history of cheap food is also the history of the conditions that made cheap food necessary, and the honest telling of the history requires both the acknowledgement of the culinary intelligence that the conditions produced, and the recognition of the injustice of the conditions themselves. But the culinary intelligence was real. The skill was real. The specific, accumulated, tested, generationally transmitted knowledge of how to cook for people who needed every meal to count was one of the most genuinely sophisticated bodies of practical knowledge that the medieval world produced, and it was produced entirely by people whose names the historical record did not think worth preserving. The peasant woman who knew how to manage the sourdough through the winter, the alewife who knew exactly how long to malt the grain, and exactly when the fermentation was complete, the grandmother who knew the specific combination of herbs that made the winter pottage something the family looked forward to rather than merely endured, the person who remembered where the wild garlic grew and when to gather it before it went to flower. These were the people who fed the medieval world, not the Lord's cook with the spices and the refined flour and the expensive imported ingredients, the people with the clay pot and the knowledge of how to use it, the people for whom the Hungry Gap was not a historical concept, but the annual test of everything they knew. They knew more than we give them credit for, and the food they made, within the constraints they lived within, was better than we remember.